of time that I wanted to allot this into. So this will be just kind of a brief overview on the importance of feeder invertebrate care and welfare, and how they relate to the care and welfare of the animals in the collections that we care for. And so it's going to be brief. We'll talk about the 5 freedoms, how they apply to feeder animals, the importance of good treatment of our feeders. So I have been an ectotherms keeper for quite a long time, up until recently. With my invertebrate talk, I did all of the invertebrates in our collection at Fort Worth Zoo Museum of Living Art. And I also ended up taking over all of our feeders for MOLA. We kind of had a feeder schedule, rotation schedule, but I ended up asking if I could take over all of the feeders because we had quite a few, and that really actually kind of made me more cognizant of like the care and keeping of feeder invertebrates. I'm currently at Henson Robinson Zoo, which is in Springfield, Illinois. So I'm the general curator there. And that's just a little bit about me. So the 5 freedoms, which we use for animal care in our collections, should be applied also to any live feeder animals, any feeder colonies that we have in the collection. And to be honest, because we take care of these animals for a short period of time, their care is pretty brief. Usually we receive, a shipment. It might be once a week. You unpack the animals, you take care of them for a few days to a couple of weeks, and you feed them out over that time. So their setups can be very simple and still meet their welfare. But these same freedoms do apply as they would to collection animals. So if you attended the invertebrate welfare talk, I went through these in more detail. That stuff does still apply to feeders. It translates pretty well. But obviously, freedom from hunger and thirst are important. It's very important that the food that your feeders are receiving is high quality and varied so that they can pass on those nutrients to the animals that are eating them, as well as providing a water source. It's very stressful on invertebrates to be packed and shipped to their destination. They usually are shipped with like potato pieces, but usually when you receive them, they can be a bit dehydrated. So it's very important that they have access to either water in the form of water crystals or water in the form of fresh produce and citrus pieces. It's very easy, especially for mealworms and superworms that live in like a bran or a cornmeal substrate, to become dehydrated, and they need to be supplemented with fresh produce so that they can stay hydrated, so they can pass that on to the animals that'll be eating them. Freedom from discomfort is pretty basic. You need to be housing them in a temperature range and humidity range that's appropriate for them. A lot of animals or a lot of inverts that are used as feeders are pretty tolerant of temperatures, but they need to be kept warm enough that their body is metabolizing the food that they're eating. You don't want to keep them cool to the point where there's food in an arrested state in their gut. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to specifics. From pain, injury, and disease, you want to make sure the enclosures are clean. And we discussed that with invertebrates on exhibit. You don't want them in an enclosure with a bunch of other dead feeder animals. You want to remove the dead animals, which a lot of times cleaning in between shipments, when you get new cricket shipment, new mealworm shipment, that's a good time to clean out the enclosure so that you can start fresh. Sometimes though, it does help to clean after you receive them, because they're going to have bits of their shipment food in there. There will be dead animals and there's molt. So sometimes when you unpack something like crickets, I'll probably use that as an example multiple times. You can dump them out and then sweep out the bottom and then start clean from that position. And from I guess the unfed animals to the enclosure, that would probably do a little bit better under fear and distress. So any animals you don't feed out, make sure they go back to their enclosure in a timely fashion so they can have access to those resources again, that food and water again, and get rehydrated and full up for their feed out. And then freedom to express normal behaviors. This is not something that's going to go into like enrichment. So there was a paper, normal behaviors, in their time that you have them, giving them the opportunity to burrow in the case of some of these larval species, and thermoregulate, things like that. Just very basic. You want to be able to give them the basic window to express normal behaviors in the period of time that you're maintaining them. And as far as quick euthanasia, I didn't touch on that as much in this finished talk as I had wanted to, but if you need to pre-kill a cricket, pre-kill a superworm so that they don't bite the prey if you're tongue feeding, just make it quick. Make it, don't create a situation of suffering for them if they need to be incapacitated for proper handling. So fundamental rights, I went over fundamental rights with invertebrate welfare, and this is not rights as in equality of species. They don't have the same rights as humans or big cats or fish. I mean, every animal has fundamental rights. And what I mean by that here is just that they have the right to as comfortable of a life as possible in between their arrival, the shipment arrival, and then their feed out. So just taking good care of them like you would take good care of the animals in your collection. They have the right for gentle and respectful handling, and this applies more towards inverts, collection inverts that are not feeders, but just not roughing them up any more than they need to be. So limiting the stress of handling and prep for feeding and things like that, just being gentle. I don't mean kissing each one gently before you put them in, but just being respectful, which many zookeepers are. And then also what we just talked about with being, quick euthanasia, if you need to squish them so that you can feed them, consider it. So this is not an animal rights talk, but there are elements that feeder invertebrates have the right to, and the biggest one is their care. Yes, hello. So it is very important for zoos to kind of see their feeder collection, even though it's a transient kind of population, to treat their feeders like they would their collection animals. Their health and well-being directly affects the quality of life, especially, I come from a background of reptiles and amphibians, which eat almost exclusively invertebrates, and so all of their nutrition are coming from those invertebrates and what they are eating, what they pick up from the environment, and the supplements that you add to them. And so it's very important. In some ways, they are extremely important, more so than collection animals, because they're used as a resource for the animals in our care. So just like produce, meat, things like that you would feed out to your animals, that all needs to be high quality, and that goes for feeders as well. You don't have to be an expert, obviously, to care for some of these species, but you need to be able to know what is the best type of housing, food, those types of things, how to clean them most effectively, when they need to be cleaned. It's just all brief training that I feel like can sometimes lack in a collection, whether or not it's just there's a not knowing and then there's a not caring. I don't think the issue is not caring. I think it's just not knowing that their husbandry can be improved. So the basics of healthy feeders, it's very similar to the basics that we have for animals in our collection. You want their enclosures to be clean. We get a high number, usually, of feeder inverts in on shipments. And you tend to keep them in high densities for a short period of time. But even if you clean when you receive them, and then about the halfway point until your next shipment, you sweep out the bottoms of the enclosures, you get rid of the dead crickets, dead invertebrates. That's it's good housekeeping for them. That sometimes can be difficult. When I worked at Fort Worth, I'll talk a little bit about our crickets there. They were in an easy to clean setup that just allowed you to remove the carton and sweep the bottoms, and that kept it very, very clean. Fresh water, appropriate food and water sources. So if you are feeding produce, make sure you're changing it out. If you have a grain as a base, make sure that grain's not in there for weeks because it can go stale. And then hydration, which we discussed. So one thing too is if you do produce for some of these feeder invertebrates, to make sure that there's enough for everybody. If they are clearing the food out by the end of the day, throw some more produce in for overnight because not every animal got to eat, and you want them to be fed up for the next day. And then, as with collection and vertebrate care, you want to make sure that you are limiting the exposure these animals have to dead conspecifics. So crickets are pretty indiscriminate with what they eat, and you want them to be eating more of the good food than you do of the paper products and the dead animals in their enclosure, because they will eat them if they have to. But you don't ever want it to get to that point, because then you're feeding dead animals to a feeder that's going to feed your animals. So just cleanliness, obviously. Returning unfed animals to their enclosure. This was something that was really harped on us at Fort Worth Zoo, is that if you have a bowl of superworms out and you're feeding them out, but you run and do something else and you forget about them and they're there overnight, it's not the end of the world, but it is more comfortable for those animals to go back to their holding enclosures as long as they haven't touched the enclosure of an animal. There's sometimes issues with that. You don't want to take them out of an enclosure and possibly contaminate the other feeders that way. But anything you have left over, just put them back so that they can go back to eating and drinking and, you know, just being healthy for the next time. And one thing too that kind of has to be kept in mind, unless you have a really stable environment, is that sometimes you might have to add supplemental heat depending on the season, depending on where the animals are in a room. If they're close to an outer wall or a window, they might get cold. That coldness slows down their metabolism, so just keeping an eye on that. And then when you receive animals, which this usually is not an issue, but when you receive them, making sure that they're unpacked and set up with food and water as soon as possible. Yeah, as soon as they arrive, so that they can settle in and limit their stress. It's important for them. So, but these are most commonly fed no matter the species. So a couple of things about crickets. One thing is bare bottom tends to work well unless you're breeding. Keeping a bare bottom plastic tote or aquarium lets you use a little hand sweeper really quickly to clean up all the mess that they make. And that's worked the best in my experience. So even if you have like high density, it's just easier to sweep them up than it is to pick out pieces of dead cricket from warmer. So they need to be kept above 70, 75 in order to metabolize, to break down their food appropriately. But if you set them up with a low wattage heat lamp, depending on if you're using a big tote or an aquarium, they'll bask under that heat lamp on the egg carton, and then they'll move about. They will thermoregulate. However, humidity is very damaging to crickets. That's why when you keep them in high densities and you do not clean out the dead animals, the decomposition will create humidity and it causes respiratory issues. And that tends to be why, besides temperature extremes, that a lot of crickets will die during shipment. If there's no external control of that humidity, they do not like high humidity. So it's important that the paper products that you use for them, like egg carton and those cardboard like accordions, I couldn't figure out what they were called, that like fold out. They love those to hide in between all the little tunnels, or cardboard tubes, that those stay dry, that they don't sit in the water dish, because it just creates a situation quick where you lose a lot of crickets. And again, you want to give them alternatives to chewing on cardboard. Sometimes they'll just eat the cardboard because that's what they want to do. But giving them the produce, pieces of carrot, pieces of sweet potato, greens, they'll usually like all run to it when you put it in. If you use like normally a grain-based diet, like a gut-loading diet, if you toss romaine in there, they'll all swarm it. But there's inevitably going to be some animals that consume paper products, but obviously people keep these as pets or keep them as feeders for pets and may not give them anything but cardboard. And we've yet to really see any of the long-term implications of, I don't know, reptiles and amphibians in particular consuming paper as a secondary as ingesting it secondary when they eat the crickets. Boy, I'm very eloquent. So at Fort Worth, we didn't use the water gel that you see frequently as feeders. I think Fluker's has it, and it's just like the jar of, pardon me, sorry, I was watching my neighbor, the jar of like colored water crystals. I don't have sources for this, so don't hold me to this, but when I was at Fort Worth, we switched from those water crystals to polymer, the soil water crystals, which are, they expand like 200 or 300 times the size when they're hydrated, and we would keep them in a big jar and fill up those water crystals, and we would feed those out. And I was told that they would drink water from the surfaces of those instead of consuming some of the products that you get in like the commercial cricket water gels. And then you could actually reuse them. You could take the dry water crystals, rinse them and reuse them a couple of times. And that worked really well. That was what I was taught. And the soil water crystals, I don't think are as expensive, but you can buy them in larger quantities, and the reuse is really important. I could never do that with the commercial water crystals. Daily cleaning is difficult. However, if you have a large number of animals in a shipment and you're trying to avoid a die-off from the humidity caused by the decomposition of dead crickets, it's important to sweep them out. It's as simple as lifting the egg carton a little bit, sweeping out from under it, and then kind of cleaning around them. We used, I don't know the exact brand, but that white bin on the rolly things, that was what we housed our crickets in at Fort Worth. We had 8 or 10 bins from pinheads to adults, and they were open topped. They were bare bottomed. All we provided was a dish for food, a dish for the water crystals, and then they had a mounted light above each tub that was only maybe 60 watts, and they were kept in the kitchen. So we kept an eye on the kitchen temperature. We turned the heat lights off when the room temperature was getting near like 85, because they would get too hot. But man, they will sit underneath and bask as a group to pretty high temperatures. So in my experience, we have not really had a die-off from high heat as much as we have from high humidity. So I really recommend those. Glass aquariums are good. Plastic totes that have screens on top sometimes are not enough ventilation for crickets. If you can have an open top, that's ideal, because for whatever reason, just the seal, even on a screen lidded enclosure, can create too much humidity for them. They don't really care for it. So one thing with the powder supplements, this is just a pet peeve. I don't really know how much of this is an issue, but when you use calcium or vitamin powder to dust crickets, it's important to use enough that it coats them in like a fine powder. That way they are not like caked with it. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine to be able to see where somebody is dumping, their feeder crickets, because there's a little pile of powder, white powder from the calcium where they usually go in. So you want to dust them lightly. The other issue is if you don't feed them out and you end up putting them back, and you dump all of that powder into the enclosure or on the water crystals, it creates kind of a paste. And crickets will groom that calcium powder off of them. That's why you dust them and feed them out quickly so that they're consumed with the powder on top. But they'll groom their body because they breathe through the spiracles on their abdomen. So they get coated in the calcium powder. It can affect their respiration. And you don't want to cake it on so much that it's suffocating them if they're not going to be fed out. And again, this is just through my experience. It's cleaner to not cake the powder on, and it's better for the animals when you put them back. And if you're going to dispatch them before feeding, just do it fast. The roaches are pretty easy. I remembered roaches at the last minute, so there's not a whole lot of information. They tend to be cleaner than crickets. They don't produce as much waste as crickets if you have like equal numbers in a colony. But like crickets, they do best on a bare bottom, unless you're setting them up. If you have like a hissing cockroach colony that you use for exhibit, but use for feeders, sometimes those are separate. But if you have them as an exhibit colony, obviously substrate and proper humidity is important. But for feeders, thank you, the bare bottom helps keep everything clean. You can just sweep it. You don't have to pick anything out. It reduces the amount of time that you put into their care, and it just keeps them from consuming other dead crickets. So they have a pretty varied diet. I didn't get to spend too much time on diet, but with invertebrates that are generalists like crickets and roaches, giving them lots of different types of produce in addition to what? Yes, addition to the feeders, the commercial feeds, pardon me, the grains that you feed them. Varied diet is just important. They pass that on, and it's also good if you have, this comes from a herp background, but if you have reptiles or amphibians that feed on specific species of invertebrates in the wild that are more carnivorous, you can always set aside portions of your feeders and feed them egg yolks. We did that at Fort Worth for some of our gecko species that would be eating animals that were not eating flora and fruit. They'd be eating smaller prey items, and or they'd be detritivores. And so you can kind of vary their diet to match that. I know some geckos that I've worked with in the past that were predators of inverts that ate a lot of fruit. I was always taught to kind of gear that more towards the nutrients that they would be getting in the wild. So mealworms and superworms, I think out of most of the animals that are kept, are usually kept like the simplest and sometimes not the best conditions. These can be kept at room temperature. It's important, and I'll say that too for waxworms and some of the other feeder inverts that are kept in the fridge, that it's important that if you keep them at a cool temperature, that you warm them up before you feed them out, even if it's for 15 minutes, to make sure that they're alive. There's a lot of times, like if you go to PetSmart or Petco and you get feeder larvae like this, you don't really know which of them are actually alive. Once you warm them up, they may be dead. And you don't want to feed dead or decomposing invertebrates to your animals. So superworms and mealworms, we keep ours at room temperature at my current zoo. We keep them on like a cornmeal substrate. A lot of times people will keep them on oat or bran or chicken feed. But if they are on that, like I mentioned earlier, make sure that they're getting romaine, that they're getting sweet potato, they're getting white potato, really any type of starch. And then every once in a while, give them a piece of apple, and that helps with their hydration. So they don't get any water from their surroundings when they're kept on these substrates. But it's a trade-off because you're encouraging a natural behavior, which is burrowing. And since these are usually kept in large numbers and they last quite a while, if they don't go into pupation, it's important that they're able to burrow if that's what they want to be doing. Yeah. Whoa. So there are a lot of inverts that are kept in cold temperatures to avoid their development, which is totally understandable. So spike fly larvae, soldier fly larvae, those turn into big, nasty black bottle flies. Waxworms turn into moths. Night crawlers don't turn into anything, but they are usually kept cool, just so that they don't really require any additional care. But if you keep these animals in an arrested state, they are usually, the standard fridge that's used for produce is too cold. Usually these animals can be in arrested development at about 60 to 65 degrees. Most fridges is usually like in the high 40s. So you have to be sure that after storing them, that when you are pulling them out for feeding, that they're not dead or decomposing animals. Night crawlers, you can tell pretty easily because they're still pretty active at cold temperatures, but animals like waxworms and any of the fly larvae, sometimes because it's kept too cold, they can pass away. And you wouldn't know unless they were warmed to room temperature. Now, with feeding them, you don't want to feed them if they're going to be kept cold because they're not able to metabolize. So that's something to keep in mind, is if you're gut loading them, you want to make sure that they're at least at room temperature so that the food isn't rotting in their system. You don't want to feed them lettuce and then toss them in the fridge, because what they ate will just sit in their gut, which isn't good. And one method that we did, depending on how many animals you have to care for, there's some situations where it's just completely impossible. But if you need to pull out waxworms, and you pull out the amount you need, or take a cup out of the fridge, they usually come in the cups, and you leave it out overnight with produce, you can do it then. So if you want to gut load waxworms, you pull them from the fridge, you give them their food, you let them sit overnight, they will have eaten, then they're actually warm enough to metabolize, and then they'll pass on those nutrients. But you want to avoid both feeding dead due to refrigeration, or animals with cold gut, loaded gut. You don't want to feed those out. So if you think of it, it's just more of a benefit to feed these animals out if they have a stomach full of produce than if they are just on an empty stomach, or have a decayed food in their stomach. So why bother? This goes back to all inverts in collections, but unlike inverts that are kept in display and education collections, these animals are directly fed to other animals. So they play a role in the maintenance of other animals in the collection. And so it's important that they're kept clean, that they get appropriate food and water, that they're kept at a temperature where they can metabolize what they consume, and then that they're presented in a palatable way so that they're more likely to be eaten. And as I mentioned earlier in the talk, it's very important for zoos to extend their high quality of care to their feeders. This just sets a good example. It shows compassion and consideration for animals that normally are just kind of seen as junk. I'm going to mention this because this person's no longer in the field, but when I was caring for superworms, I had them on a cleaning schedule, but I was told that they were just bugs, that they didn't need fresh food and they didn't need to be cleaned because they were just bugs. If you're an invert keeper, you know that that's not the case, but if you're an animal keeper in general, you know that no animal is just something. So in the case of feeder inverts, they're not just bugs. They're a staple in the diet for captive collections, and so their consideration is important. So thanks. I can't believe I did this in the time limit that was allotted. I have 4 minutes left. This is one of my sweet flower beetles that we had at Fort Worth, and I think I'll continue to use her as the exit screen.